Good afternoon and welcome to the 31st Annual Earlie E. Thorpe Memorial Lecture. My name is Janet Gerstenhorn and I'm a professor of history at North Carolina Central University, and it has been my honor to help organize this lecture series in recent years in honor of Dr. Earlie E. Thorpe. I want to thank Dr. Lopez Matthews of Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Research Center and the Association for the Study of African American Life and History for their co-sponsorship and assistance with today's program. I'd also like to thank Dr. Jim Harper, Chair of the Department of History at NCCU, for his support for this lecture. We're looking forward to Dr. Crystal Sanders' talk today, but first we're going to see a brief video about the Department of History at NCCU.
This is our history.
This is our legacy.
This is NCCU's History Department.
This is North Carolina Central University's Department of History.
So now we're going to hear from several NCCU Eagles who will bring greetings. Then I'll discuss the occasion and introduce today's speaker. We'll hear first from Dr. Carlton Wilson, Dean of the College of Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities. Then Dr. Jim Harper, Chair of the Department of History at NCCU. And after him, Ms. Brittney Reeves, President of the Earlie E. Thorpe Graduate Student Historian Society. Dr. Wilson.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Jerry. I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone on behalf of North Carolina Central University and the College of Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities. We are so pleased to have you with us this afternoon as we once again celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Earlie E. Thorpe. It is a very beautiful afternoon here on the campus of North Carolina Central University here in Durham. Clearly, today's lecture, the Thorpe Lecture, is one of the joys of the fall season and one of the highlights of the entire academic year here at North Carolina Central University. So we are so pleased to have students, faculty, our friends at the ASLH here to celebrate and to experience this wonderful event with us. Once again, we would like to especially thank the Thorpe family. To the Thorpe family, our prayers continue to be with you with the recent loss of your mom, our mom, Mrs. Thorpe. We miss her dearly. We thank you for sharing your dad, Dr. Thorpe, and Mrs. Thorpe with us for so many years. So our thoughts and prayers continue to be with the entire Thorpe family. It is such an honor to continue to have this lecture to recognize Dr. Thorpe, the legacy that he's had here at North Carolina Central University, his impact on so many of us. Dr. Thorpe taught many of us, he mentored dozens and dozens of students. And as all of you know, he had a tremendous impact on the study of history. His scholarship that expanded all aspects of history, not only psychohistory, but African American, American history, even European history. My first class with Dr. Thorpe was actually a European history course. And I believe I was the only student in the class, which was a very frightening experience for me. However, I enjoyed that Saturday morning engaging with Dr. Thorpe. He offered me so much, as he did with so many students. So clearly, we are so pleased to continue to sponsor this lecture. We hope that one day soon we will be back on campus on this fall afternoon to have all of you join us in person. We especially thank Dr. Crystal Sanders for taking time out of her very busy schedule to share her wonderful scholarship with us this afternoon. So once again, greetings on behalf of North Carolina Central University. Thank you for joining us. Many thanks to the association for arranging this particular telecast. So we're very pleased that you are here. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim C. Harper II, Chair and Professor of History for the Department of History here at North Carolina Central University. On behalf of the faculty and students of the Department of History, I welcome you to the 31st Annual Earlie E. Thorpe Memorial Lecture Series. We're excited about hearing the lecture from this year's speaker, Dr. Crystal Sanders. We express our condolences to the Thorpe family for the loss of their mother. The Thorpe family's legacy will continue to be honored through this lecture series. And we thank each of you for taking the time to watch this lecture as it is streamed live on a solid TV. Enjoy the program, and thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittney Reeves, and I'm the president of the E.E. Thorpe Graduate Historian Society. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the 31st Annual E.E. Thorpe Lecture. On behalf of the Earlie E. Thorpe Graduate Historian Society, we would like to thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend this event. The inspirational values that E.E. Thorpe shared throughout his scholastic career are still upheld and enforced here at North Carolina Central University's History Department. E.E. Thorpe dedicated his life and career to ensuring that Black historians had a voice in the field of history and preserving Black historic events that were consistently overlooked. By doing this, he presented an imperative perspective of history through the Black lens. His work, words, and dedication have helped shape and mold many modern historians by offering a new perspective, and it is our expectation that this lecture from Dr. Crystal Sanders today will have the same effect on each of you. So thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the great information shared in today's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I'd like to offer a brief biography of Dr. Thorpe. But before I do so, I'd like to honor the memory of Dr. Thorpe's wife, Mrs. Martha Vivian Branch Thorpe, who passed away 12 days ago at the age of 95. Like her husband, they were married in 1946. Mrs. Thorpe brought light and love, and she also brought music to many people's lives. Born in Durham, North Carolina in 1925, she graduated from Hillside High School in 1942, and she was a classmate of her future husband, Earlie Thorpe, whom she met when they were in the 9th grade. During the graduation ceremony, Mrs. Thorpe performed Prelude in C# minor by Rachmaninoff on piano. She went on to earn a BA degree in music and English from Bennett College and a Master of Education degree from Southern University in Baton Rouge. She was a teacher for 35 years, often teaching music in Alabama, Louisiana, and North Carolina. In fact, she taught for 25 of those years in Durham before retiring in 1987. A longtime member of Mount Gilead Baptist Church in Durham, she served as director and pianist for the children's and senior choirs. She was a leader in many civic and religious organizations, including serving as president of the Daughters of Dorcas. Mrs. Thorpe's legacy includes her two children, Rita Thorpe Lamb and Gloria Thorpe Doyle, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, her many students, and many others whose lives she touched. Raymond Carver wrote a brief poem called Late Fragment that applies well to the life of Mrs. Thorpe. It goes like this. And did you get what you want? What you wanted from this life? Even so, I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth. And Mrs. Thorpe was beloved on the earth. Let's pause for a moment of silence in memory of Mrs. Martha Vivian Branch Thorpe. Thank you. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about Dr. Earlie Endres Thorpe, who this program honors each year. In 1949, Earlie Thorpe, then a young Black World War II veteran, took a class in historiography, in the historiography of American history, as a 25-year-old graduate student at Ohio State University. Of all the assigned texts in the class, only one devoted any space to Black historians. Michael Krause's A History of American History, over 600 pages long, devoted less than 1 page to Black historians, with just a mention of Carter G. Woodson and several lines on W.E.B. Du Bois. Thorpe discovered that Black historiography had been ignored, not only in this class, but by the entire history profession, which was dominated by white scholars who did not consider African-American history a subject worthy of public discourse. Inspired to rectify this omission, Thorpe devoted his life to the study and dissemination of African-American history to ensure that white scholars would not solely define the history of African Americans. Born in Durham in 1924, Thorpe, who earned his BA and MA degrees in history at North Carolina College at Durham, now NCCU, and his PhD from Ohio State University, played a key role in reshaping our understanding of United States history by focusing on African Americans in his numerous publications. A prolific scholar, Dr. Thorpe published 23 journal articles and 9 books. His first book, Negro Historians in the United States, published in 1958, a revision of his doctoral dissertation, was the first work devoted to the writings of Black historians. In 2004, historian John Ernest observed, quote, "Thorpe's work on 19th century Black historians remains the pioneering and indispensable study of these historians." In 1961, Thorpe published another landmark work, The Mind of the Negro, the first comprehensive intellectual history of African Americans. Based on a broad survey of Black discourse from the antebellum era to the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education, Thorpe argued that the central theme of Black thought was African Americans' quest for freedom and equality. 40 years after its publication, historian Robert Harris Jr. observed that Mind of the Negro was, quote, still the most comprehensive study of Black thought in the United States. Influenced by the emerging field of psychohistory, Dr. Thorpe employed psychoanalytical theory to analyze the history of slavery in the antebellum South. He told historian Vincent Harding that Black historians had studied free Blacks, but not slaves, because, quote, "we seemed ashamed of the slaves," and permitted the history of slavery to be dominated by white historians like U.B. Phillips, Kenneth Stamp, and Stanley Elkins. Thorpe published 2 books on slavery, Eros and Freedom in Southern Life and Thought, 1967, and The Old South, Psychohistory, 5 years later. In the latter work, Thorpe underscored the brutality of slavery, but also documented pervasive resistance by enslaved African Americans. Emphasizing African Americans' humanity during the antebellum era, Thorpe explained that slaves employed a variety of tactics, including religious and cultural expression, escape and revolt, to resist the brutal institution of slavery. From 1980 to 82, Dr. Thorpe served as president of the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History, the premier professional association for scholars of African American history. As president, Thorpe advanced the study of Black history and helped ensure the financial survival of the association. In 1980, during Dr. Thorpe's presidency, the association played a leading role in President Jimmy Carter's declaration making February Afro-American History Month. Dr. Thorpe's legacy extends well beyond his scholarly studies. He helped develop a new generation of historians at North Carolina Central University, where he taught from 1962 until his death in 1989, by encouraging his students to become professional historians. He and his students helped to transform the historical profession. From 1969 to 1989, 27 NCCU history majors earned PhDs in history. And since that time, Dr. Thorpe's students and his students' students have extended that legacy as dozens of NCCU students have earned PhDs in history. and many of them are teaching at prominent universities throughout the country today. So now it is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Crystal Sanders earned a BA in History and Public Policy from Duke University and an MA and PhD degrees in History from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. She is presently an Associate Professor of History at Penn State University, where she teaches US history and African American history. In 2016, Dr. Sanders published A Chance for Change, Head Start and Mississippi's Black Freedom Struggle, published by the University of North Carolina Press, which won the Critics' Choice Book Award from the American Educational Studies Association and the New Scholars Book Award from Division F of the American Educational Research Association. And I've assigned that book many times in my graduate history classes, and always to great acclaim from the students. It's just a wonderful book, and I commend it to all of you out there to read it if you get a chance. She has also published a number of articles in a variety of journals, including the Journal of African American History, the Journal of Southern History, the North Carolina Historical Review, and the History of Education Quarterly. From 2020 to 2021, just last year, she was a fellow at the National Humanities Center. And recently, just I think a week or two ago, she won the American Historical Association's Equity Award, given to those who have achieved excellence in recruiting and retaining underrepresented racial and ethnic groups into the historical discipline. Her talk this afternoon is entitled America's Forgotten Migration, the Black Pursuit for Graduate Education During the Age of Jim Crow. So let's please welcome Dr. Crystal Sanders.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gerstenhorn, for that warm introduction, and good afternoon to all of you who are joining me. It is my absolute honor to deliver the 31st annual Dr. Earlie Thorpe Memorial Lecture. I'm very thankful for the invitation to give this lecture, not just because Dr. Thorpe is a giant in our field, but also because NCCU has a special place in my heart. My mother received her Bachelor of Science degree in nursing from NCCU. I won't say what year as a way of not upsetting her, but she had a great experience there, and I have benefited from the education that she received. Today, I will be sharing work from my forthcoming book, and NCCU, including its founder, its alumni, and its faculty, play central roles in the story that I will tell. So I will go into slideshow view. And we'll jump right in. What you see on the screen are a series of letters between NCCU founder and president James Shepherd and Black North Carolinians who wrote to him seeking financial assistance from the state of North Carolina to pursue graduate and professional school education. The letters are a physical reminder of Black aspiration and striving during the age of Jim Crow. Before 1936, there were only 7 schools in the South, all private institutions, where African Americans could pursue graduate or professional school study. Those institutions were Howard University, Hampton Institute, Fisk University, Meharry Medical College, Gammon Theological Seminary, Atlanta University, and Xavier University. Graduate offerings at these institutions were limited. For example, graduate work at Hampton was only possible in education, and the courses were only offered during the summer. No Black institution conferred the PhD degree until 1954. And so I'm enlarging one of the letters to give you a sense of the kind of correspondence that President Shepherd received daily from Black North Carolinians requesting financial assistance for advanced study. And this was a letter from a woman by the name of Miss Brody, I believe, who was requesting aid to go to Columbia to pursue a doctorate in education. Except for a brief window during the late 19th century, when both the University of South Carolina and the University of Maryland admitted Black students to the professional school programs, most Southern and border states denied African Americans access to tax-supported graduate education in the region until the 1950s or later. These states compelled Black residents to go out of state for anything beyond the bachelor's degree, subjecting them to the indignities of traveling while Black during the era of legal segregation, throwing them into Northern institutions that did not roll out the proverbial welcome mat for Black Southerners, and separating them from their families for longer periods of time than required of white students who were able to remain in state for advanced study. For certain, Black Southerners have been going north for graduate study at their own expense for decades. West Virginia native and former slave Inman Page earned his master's degree from Brown University in 1880. Carter G. Woodson, a son of Virginia, earned bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Chicago before obtaining a doctoral degree in history from Harvard University in 1912. Josephine Dobbs Clement, one of the daughters of Georgia's well-known John Wesley Dobbs, had come of age in Atlanta's Sweet Auburn district before earning a master's degree in home economics from Columbia University in 1938. To be young, gifted, and Black, with no opportunities to conduct advanced study in the region of one's birth was a hardship that many knew well. Thus, leaving home in pursuit of a graduate degree was nothing new. What was new was leaving home with financial assistance from Southern state governments. I refer to the funds that these Southern states appropriated for Black citizens' graduate and professional school training as segregation scholarships, since the entire purpose of the tuition assistance was to preserve segregation. I plan to spend the majority of my time considering how segregation scholarships worked in the states of Virginia and North Carolina, but it is important to look at the origins of this sordid educational arrangement. In 1920, Walthall Moore, a Black man who you see pictured on the screen, was elected to the Missouri state legislature. Moore's presence in the State House would set into motion a number of important educational changes for African Americans, not only in Missouri, but throughout the entire South. Prior to Moore's election, Missouri rarely provided its Black citizens the same educational opportunities as white citizens, a practice that helped to preserve segregation and the racial caste system that limited African Americans' social, political, and economic trajectories. An Alabama transplant, it would be Moore who would introduce out-of-state tuition grants for Black college students, and he's the one who made advanced degrees a more realistic possibilities for Black Southerners in Missouri and throughout the region. The grants, which were the first of their kind in the United States, allowed Black students to study at Black or white institutions that offered graduate study and served as a forerunner to the equalization strategies that Black activists pursued to improve Black education at the elementary and secondary school levels. Less than a month after taking office, Moore introduced a bill seeking $1 million to improve higher education for African American residents in his state. The state's sole college for African Americans, Lincoln Institute, was a far cry in terms of funding, physical plant, and academic offerings from the well-funded flagship institution for white residents, the University of Missouri. Moore's end goal, though, was never realized, and his end goal was an upgraded Lincoln that gave African Americans in Missouri the same opportunities that were available to white residents of the state. He envisioned state assistance for African Americans to pursue post-baccalaureate education elsewhere as a temporary response to address Missouri's higher educational neglect of its Black citizens. Thus, segregation scholarships were not created with nefarious intent. Rather, they were a provisional arrangement to meet Black aspiration for advanced study out of state until the state's Black institution received the public investment necessary to meet Black needs. So when Moore introduces this idea of using tax dollars to send Black students out of state, it was a temporary measure. It was something that was to occur until Lincoln was brought up to be of the quality, right, as the same as the University of Missouri. Segregationists, however, quickly embraced Walthall Moore's suggestion of exiling Black students because it allowed them to delay questions about integration or educational equality. They found it more economical to outsource indefinitely the state's responsibility to educate African Americans rather than build up the state's lone Black college. So what you see on the screen is the actual bill that made segregation scholarships legal in the state of Missouri. And so this bill, when you look at really 7 of the 8 sections, are dealing with upgrading Lincoln. But until Lincoln was fully upgraded, that section 7 was going to use tax dollars to send Black residents out of state. What began in Missouri soon spread to other Southern states. In subsequent years, West Virginia, Maryland, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Texas, Arkansas, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi set up their own systems of providing scholarships to Black students to study out of state as a way to preserve segregation. As you see the dates that the states adopted their segregation scholarship programs, what you can see is that the states with the largest Black populations were the last to create out-of-state funding for graduate and professional education of their Black citizens. The only southern or border state that made no graduate provision for Black residents was Delaware. So we can see this was a trend spreading across the entire southern region. When you look at these states that are shaded in red, you see that segregation scholarships became really the answer for segregationists rather than invest in Black education at home. It is important to note that many states started or continued their scholarship programs until the 1960s, defying the historic 6-2 decision in Gaines v. Canada in 1938, where the United States Supreme Court ruled that states had a responsibility to offer white and Black citizens the same education within their borders. The court gave border and southern states 3 options to meet their constitutional obligation. They could discontinue graduate and professional school programs at historically white institutions, or they could desegregate graduate and professional school programs at historically white institutions, or they could establish separate but equal graduate and professional school programs at Black institutions. The Gaines decision outlawed segregation scholarships, and it was the first successful legal challenge against the doctrine of separate but equal and paved the way for the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. And I say this when I teach my students, I tell them about the importance of enforcement, right? Because we see in 1938 that the court is saying you can't send Black students elsewhere and provide those same services to white students within your state's borders. But if we go back to the slide before and you look at these dates, we see that the majority of Southern states create their segregation scholarship programs after the Gaines decision is announced. So what that tells us is that Supreme Court cases are meaningless without enforcement. And in this case, there was no enforcement. The NAACP will go into court for the next 20 years trying to get enforcement of a decision that should have ended it in 1938. In response to Gaines, many states like North Carolina established a few underfunded graduate and professional school programs at public Black colleges. Missouri went so far as to discontinue its storied graduate journalism program at the University of Missouri rather than desegregate. Most egregiously, many states, North Carolina included, established their segregation scholarship programs after Gaines. And Southern recalcitrants in the educational arena proved this hollow victory of court orders without enforcement. And as some of you might recall, even before Gaines, the NAACP had gone into court and began seeking educational equality in higher education. Their first victory did not have national implications, though, and that first victory came in Maryland in the case of Donald Murray, who wanted to attend the University of Maryland Law School. Maryland officials offered to pay for Murray to go to law school at Columbia, Harvard, or Howard, anywhere but at the University of Maryland, where Murray's tax dollars and the tax dollars of his family subsidized the education of non-Black students. I'm careful to say non-Black because Maryland admitted more than white students. There were Chinese students, there were Japanese students, there were Indian students at the University of Maryland at the time that Donald Murray was seeking entrance to the law school. In both the Maryland Circuit Court in 1935 and the Maryland Court of Appeals in 1936, justices ordered the University of Maryland to admit Donald Murray, since Maryland had only one public law school, and according to the Constitution, that law school had to be open to people of all races. So we know that the NAACP's first victory comes earlier than the Gaines case, but there's not a national implication or a national precedent, because that legal challenge never made it to the Supreme Court. So even though the Murray decision was not binding outside of Maryland, Southern states began taking action in its wake. And Virginia made provision for Black graduate study after Alice Carlotta Jackson, who you see pictured on the screen, a 22-year-old Black woman who hailed from the capital of the Confederacy, applied to the University of Virginia in August of 1935. Jackson had earned a bachelor's degree in English from the all-Black and private Virginia Union University in her hometown of Richmond, and had done additional study at Smith College in Massachusetts. She desired a master's degree in French, but none of the Black colleges in Virginia, including the public Virginia State College in Petersburg, offered graduate work. Thus, she applied to UVA. As expected, university officials refused Jackson admission on the basis of her race. The threat of a legal challenge based on the inexistence of separate but equal educational facilities led Virginia's lawmakers to create master's degree programs in elementary and secondary education at the all-Black Virginia State College in Petersburg. Next, state lawmakers established a segregation scholarship program. Virginia's program was unique, though, and that scholarship applicants had to apply to Virginia's historically white universities first, and if university officials deemed them eligible for admission, then they could receive a segregation scholarship to study outside of the state. Alice Jackson became one of Virginia's first segregation scholarship recipients. She used state funds to earn a master's degree in English from Columbia University in 1937. She was one of 126 inaugural recipients of state aid from the state of Virginia. Alice Jackson's experience demonstrated that segregation scholarships in no way made Black graduate study equal to that of white students. She received $61.48 from Virginia to offset expenses incurred during her summer term at Columbia. The amount covered only 20% of her expenses to live and study in New York. Things did not get any better during the regular academic year. While Virginia agreed to give Jackson $75 each semester, the differential between tuition at Columbia and the University of Virginia exceeded $150. So Jackson had to spend significantly more than she would have if racism did not prohibit her from studying at her state's flagship. Rather than admit that they were in violation of the segregation scholarship law that required the state to pay the differential in tuition fees, Virginia officials told Jackson to study at a cheaper institution. I mentioned the Virginia Segregation Scholarship Program because another inaugural recipient of tuition assistance from Old Dominion was an individual with strong ties to North Carolina Central University. Helen Gray Edmonds of Lawrenceville, Virginia, received a segregation scholarship in the amount of $68.30 for graduate school in 1936. The amount of aid was based on the expense Virginia allotted for its residents at UVA, plus an allowance for the difference in living costs between Charlottesville and Columbus, where Dr. Edmonds chose to study, and she received funds for the difference in transportation costs to Charlottesville and Columbus. State officials asserted that such an arrangement satisfied the legal doctrine of separate but equal. Edmonds had graduated from Morgan State College in 1933 with a bachelor's degree in history. She used state funds from Virginia to enter the history graduate program in Ohio State in 1936, earning her master's degree in 1938 and her doctorate in 1946. Edmonds was the first Black woman to earn a doctorate in history from Ohio State University and the third Black woman to earn a doctorate at that institution overall. But it's important that we put these feats in context. Ohio State was not a hospitable place for African Americans in the 1930s and 1940s. The school's athletic honor society, Bucket and Dipper, denied admission to Jesse Owens in 1936, even though Owens was the best athlete in Ohio State's history. White students wrote into Ohio State's campus newspaper during Edwards' tenure there, arguing that in a country governed by the Nordic race, it is impossible to put other races on parity with the white race. Negroes should not be allowed to eat where we of the white race do, nor should they be allowed to go to any of our schools. If one starts it, they will all follow and soon take various places over completely. That was a direct quote from the campus newspaper. By 1937, bigotry at Ohio State led white students to establish a student organization called the Anti-Negro Guild that opposed integrated campus facilities. This was the environment that Professor Edwards found herself subject to because the University of Virginia was off limits to her and Virginia's Black schools did not offer advanced study in her discipline. Persevering in spite of the bigotry, she went on to have an illustrious career at North Carolina Central University, where she was on the faculty from 1941 until 1977. Her career success demonstrated both what was possible when Southern states created educational opportunities for Black scholars, and also what was probably lost, as many African-American Southerners, particularly Black women, did not have the luxury of relocating to a different state for graduate study. Edmonds was not the only scholar affiliated with NCCU who had ties to a segregation scholarship program. John Hope Franklin, who was on the NCC faculty from 1943 until 1947, during which time he wrote the first edition of From Slavery to Freedom, received a segregation scholarship from the state of Oklahoma. He received $100 from Oklahoma to offset expenses at Harvard during the 1935-1936 academic year. And on your screen, what you're seeing is a list of Black Oklahomans who received state aid in fiscal year 1936. And toward the bottom of that list, you'll see John Hope Franklin receiving, and I should tell you, they paid their money quarterly. So you see on the screen, it says $25, but in the records, he got $25 every quarter for a total of $100 for that 35-36 academic year. That year, the Sooner State appropriated $5,000 toward the tuition of Black students to study out of state. Unwanted at his home state's flagship institution because of racism, he found Harvard to be a socially challenging place for Black students. He later recalled, and I quote, "A day and often an hour didn't go by without my feeling the color of my skin and the reactions of white Cambridge, the behavior of my fellow students, the attitudes real and imagined struck by my professors," end quote. And in the larger story or the larger book that I'm writing, I detail a lot of Black scholars who would go on to illustrious careers at Black colleges who received segregation scholarships to offset their education. When Dr. Gerstenhorn invited me to give this lecture, I started, vigorously going through my records, trying to see if I could find Dr. Thorpe's name in any of my records. And I didn't come across his name as a recipient of segregation scholarship funds. And I wonder if that was because he was a World War II veteran, because in the case of North Carolina did not want to give aid to Black students who also had funding from the GI Bill. So there are plenty of records where we see Black students writing for assistance. And when it comes out that they're a World War II veteran, officials telling them your veterans benefit will cover your education, so you're not eligible for assistance from the state. So that very well could be one of the reasons why I did not find any information on him, though Dr. Thorpe, like Dr. Edmonds, received his PhD from Ohio State. Now, there was no NCCE goal more connected to segregation scholarships than NCCU founder and president James Shepherd, who from 1939 until his death in 1947 had almost complete control of segregation scholarships in North Carolina. North Carolina responded to the 1938 Gaines Supreme Court decision by creating a few graduate programs at NCC and at North Carolina A&T, and instituting segregation scholarship programs to make up for the limited graduate offerings. Legislators in the Tar Heel State voted to provide its Black citizens with advanced degree opportunities in March 1939, and classes began in September of that year. NCC offered graduate study in the liberal arts and in law, while NCA&T offered graduate study in agriculture and technology. 30 students enrolled in master's degree programs at NCC and 5 at A&T. Faculty from the University of North Carolina and Duke University taught some of the courses. Students desiring graduate study that was unavailable at these 2 public Black colleges became eligible for segregation scholarships. Among the first graduate cohort to enter NCC was Mildred Yancey, a Black woman from Wilson, North Carolina. Yancey's family embodied Black ambition and the belief in education as a vehicle for social mobility. Her father, D.R.C. Yancey, was among the small Black population that earned bachelor's degrees at the turn of the century, obtaining his undergraduate degree from Biddle University, which is present-day Johnson C. Smith University, in 1903, before completing the pharmacy program at the now-defunct Shaw University Leonard School of Pharmacy in 1906. He owned a thriving pharmacy in Wilson. Maude Yancey's mother, the former Leela Beatrice Ireland, studied at Scotia Seminary before becoming one of the first teachers that renowned educator Charlotte Hawkins Brown hired to teach at Palmer Memorial Institute near Greensboro. Given the educational achievements of the Yanceys, it was not surprising that their only daughter would make educational strides herself. On June the 4th, 1940, NCC awarded its very first graduate degree to Maude Yancey. She'd graduated a year earlier from Knoxville College in Tennessee before earning her master's degree in biology at NCC. Yancey went on to receive a master's in public health and a doctorate in health education from the University of Michigan in 1946 and 1952, respectively. She served on the faculties at NCC, Southern University in Baton Rouge, Elizabeth City State University, and A&T. North Carolina A&T awarded its first graduate degree in 1941 to Woodland Hall, a native Virginia who had attended the University of Maryland Eastern Shore for his undergraduate study. Hall earned a master's degree in agricultural education from North Carolina's Black Land Grant before serving as a principal in several cities throughout the state. Yancey and Hall's scholarly and professional success demonstrated the Black intellect that the South stifled when state universities excluded Black students on the basis of race. Makeshift public graduate programs at Black colleges were initially nothing more than an attempt to evade the spirit of the Gaines decision. Because the course offerings of these programs was so limited, Southern and border states also exported Black scholars with segregation scholarships. So while North Carolina created a few programs at NCC and at A&T, they also started a segregation scholarship program at the same time. What you see on the screen is a list of scholarship recipients from the state of North Carolina for the fall semester of 1941. And so typically what would happen is people would write to Shepherd for an application. He would send them an application. Once they sent it back, Shepherd would determine if they were eligible, and if so, how much money they were getting. So what you see on the screen is one of the reports that Shepherd would send in to the state superintendent of public instruction, letting him know how many people have been awarded scholarships for a particular semester and the amounts of their scholarships. So if you see on the screen, we see that these recipients are coming from Rocky Mount, Charlotte, Jacksonville, Fayetteville, Durham, Henderson, Goldsboro, all of Winston-Salem, all across North Carolina. We see people writing in for graduate assistance. And though NCC's law school first opened in September of 1939, It discontinued classes 1 week after opening because of low enrollment. Logan Delaney, a graduate of St. Augustine's College and the grandson of Henry Delaney, the first elected Black bishop of the Episcopal Church, was the lone registered student, so class discussion was impossible. The state offered to pay for Delaney to attend law school elsewhere, but he resolved to wait until NCC's law school reopened in September of 1940. Shepard, as I said, was the main administrator of these out-of-state tuition grants for Black students in North Carolina because he really oversaw all applications for graduate study except for those applications pursuing agriculture or technical disciplines. And the person who oversaw graduate applications for people in the sciences was Ferdinand Bluford, the president of North Carolina A&T. So Black citizens of North Carolina who could attest to their citizenship by church membership, voter registration, birth certificate, or tax records, and could provide proof of admission to a university were eligible for tuition assistance. Applicants could receive funding for the entire school year, for a summer session, or for both. And the summer session option really catered to Black principals and school teachers who worked full-time during the school year. Shepard and Bluford sent tuition checks, which were paid on a semester or quarterly basis, directly to the applicant's institution after receiving proof of enrollment. Students received a check in the amount equal to one round-trip railroad fare from his or her home to their graduate institution. Pullman fare was provided only if night travel was necessary. And in 1939, NCC was only offering master's work in science, mathematics, English education, and A&T was offering graduate work in animal husbandry, industrial education, and agronomy. So there were hundreds of letters arriving to Shepard's office and to Bluford's office seeking assistance to study in other fields. Unlike Missouri and Tennessee, North Carolina did not pay for Black students to pursue undergraduate study out of state, even if a student pursued a bachelor's degree program that was offered at UNC, but was not offered at any of the state's public Black colleges. The one exception to this rule was pharmacy. UNC offered white students a bachelor's degree in pharmacy, and North Carolina's Attorney General approved segregation scholarships for Black undergraduates studying pharmacy out of state because the state considered the degree program professional work, and the bill authorizing the segregation scholarship program stipulated that state awards or state funding could go to Black students for both graduate and professional courses. So in the first year that segregation scholarships were awarded in North Carolina, that was from September 1, 1939 until July 1, 1940, scholarships totaling $9,772 were given out. No applicant received the full amount of tuition that they requested, and scholars used the funding to attend some of the best institutions in the country, including Radcliffe, Atlanta University, New York University, and the University of Michigan. 8 Black men in that first group of scholarship recipients received funds to pursue medical degrees at Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. Now I'm going to briefly mention provide a sampling of some of the North Carolina segregation scholarship recipients, because the educational backgrounds and achievements of these recipients demonstrate the intellectual curiosity of Black North Carolinians who were compelled to leave home. Charles Reginald Eason, who you see on the left side of your screen, and his wife, Sarah, who you see on the right side of your screen, received funding to pursue doctorate degrees in mathematics and Romance languages, respectively, at Ohio State University in 1939. Eason, born in 1905, was a native of Elizabeth, New Jersey. He moved to North Carolina in 1930 after becoming the first African-American to earn a graduate degree in mathematics at Rutgers University. He taught math at Shaw University, the oldest Black college in the South. It was at Shaw where Eason met his wife, the former Sarah Martin. Martin, a native of Cleveland, Ohio, joined Shaw's faculty in 1931, teaching French. She earned her undergraduate degree from Ohio State University, where she was the first Black woman elected to Phi Beta Kappa, and she received her master's degree from Western Reserve University. Shaw University granted the couple leaves of absence to earn terminal degrees. Sarah Martin Eason received her doctorate degree in Romance languages in 1942 and went on to teach on the faculties of several institutions, including the University of the District of Columbia and Johnson C. Smith University. Charles Eason, for reasons that remain unclear, never completed his degree, but he returned to New Jersey where he worked as a physics teacher. Another Black Tar Heel resident who received a segregation scholarship in the inaugural year that funds were available was Eliza Atkins Gleason. Gleason, born in 1909, was the ninth and last child of Simon Green Atkins and Oleana Pegram Atkins. That name, Simon Atkins, may ring a bell because her father was the founder of Slater Industrial Academy in 1892, which is the present-day Winston-Salem State University. Her mother served as a teacher and assistant principal at the school. Before his death in 1934, Simon Atkins had moved in the same Black educational circles as James Shepherd. So Shepherd would have recognized Eliza Atkins Gleason's name when she submitted an application for state assistance. Gleason was already pursuing graduate study out of state when segregation scholarships became available for North Carolinians. She had earned a bachelor's degree from Fisk University in 1930 and a bachelor's degree in library science from the University of Illinois in 1931. The North Carolina native worked as a librarian for several years in Kentucky before earning her master's degree in library science at the University of California, Berkeley in 1936. After graduation, she had a one-year stint as an assistant professor and head of the reference department at Fisk University, and then she matriculated at the University of Chicago, where she sought a doctorate degree in library science. In 1940, Gleason became the first African-American to earn a doctorate in library science. During her final year of doctoral study, North Carolina paid $122 of Gleason's tuition and fees at the University of Chicago. The state also gave her $31.40 for tuition fare, for railroad fare. I've not located any statements from Gleason about her time at Chicago, but her time at Chicago overlapped a little with the time that Benjamin Mays was also there. And in Mays's autobiography, he talked about the high level of discrimination and prejudice that he experienced at the Midwestern institution. He recalled in particular that Black women were not allowed to stay on campus, and most of the businesses surrounding the University of Chicago refused to serve Black students. We know that rather than return to the Tar Heel State after graduation, Dr. Gleason relocated to Georgia, where she established and became the first dean of the School of Library Science at Atlanta University. And because Hampton had closed its library science program in 1936, Atlanta University became the only school in the country dedicated to training Black librarians. Between 1941 and 1986, more than 90% of all Black librarians in the United States received their training in the program that Gleason created. Segregation scholarship recipients faced numerous challenges while studying abroad. Raleigh native Elizabeth Young, who you see pictured in the center of your screen, chose to pursue a Master of Science degree in physical education at Boston University during the 1939-1940 academic year. North Carolina gave her $150 for tuition, $20 for fees, and $16.77 for railroad fare. Young, who aspired to teach physical education at the college level, assumed that the state would pay all of her tuition since she had no choice but to leave North Carolina to fulfill her career dream. Had she been white, she could have attended the University of North Carolina and received the same degree. Young expressed her disappointment about the funding gap in a letter to NCC President James Shepherd. In his response, Shepherd reminded Young that Boston University charged $300 per year, while the University of North Carolina charged $150 per year for the same course of study. The burden of making up the shortfall caused by segregation fell to Young. She made a way somehow, and after graduating, became a physical education instructor at several Black colleges, including present-day St. Augustine's University and Fayetteville State University. Many scholarship recipients expressed financial hardship. Charles Ray, who was a Raleigh native, a Durham resident, and an instructor of English at NCC, attended the University of Southern California for a PhD in English language and literature. After completing coursework, Ray relocated back to North Carolina to resume teaching at NCC, and he only traveled to California when necessary. He traveled to California for a few days in May 1952 to defend his dissertation before returning home. Once back in North Carolina, he learned that the University of Southern California required candidates for the PhD degree to appear in person to receive their diplomas. This meant that Ray needed to travel to California again, but the stipulations of North Carolina's segregation scholarship program only provided residents with one round-trip fare per academic year. The round-trip railroad fare with Pullman accommodations was $285, and a flight for the same route was $317. Ray wrote to North Carolina officials requesting financial assistance, and these officials denied his request for assistance to attend his mandatory commencement. Ray, on his own, came up with the necessary funds and became the first African-American to receive a doctorate degree in English from the University of Southern California. And what you see on the screen is the front page of a 1952 issue of the Carolina Times announcing Dr. Ray's historic doctorate from USC. Dr. Ray became a professor of English at North Carolina College, where he remained for the next quarter of a century. North Carolina officials were aware of the hardship caused by the state only providing Black students with one round-trip ticket during the academic year. In fact, 2 years before Charles Ray asked for additional travel funds, a special committee on policies and procedures for out-of-state aid met to consider revising the travel allowance. The committee acknowledged that most universities closed for an extended period between the fall and winter semesters and recommended the state revise the policy and provide 2 round-trip tickets during the regular academic year. The suggested change was not novel. Maryland provided its Black segregation scholarship recipients with 2 round-trip tickets each year. Yet Charles Carroll, the state superintendent for public instruction in North Carolina, disallowed more than 1 round-trip ticket, ignoring the tremendous burden this placed on Black citizens. The challenges of North Carolina's exiled Black scholars demonstrated that equalizing educational opportunity was impossible without desegregation. Another problem faced by Black students seeking graduate study was that the segregation scholarship law made no distinction between the PhD degree and the EDD degree. From 1952 until 1962, NCC offered the PhD degree in education. Roger Russell, who worked as a guidance counselor at NCC, applied for a summer session scholarship in 1953 to pursue an EDD at the University of Pennsylvania. The World War II veteran and Virginia native already had degrees from Virginia State College and Columbia University. He had joined NCC's staff in 1948, and his residency made him eligible for tuition assistance from North Carolina. North Carolina officials initially denied Russell's request for funds since NCC offered the PhD degree in education. Russell fought back, insisting that the degree he wanted to pursue was not offered at NCC, but was offered at UNC. In fact, UNC did offer both the EDD and the PhD in education. Russell maintained that he sought an EDD because he desired to go into administration rather than into research. After much back and forth with state officials, Russell was successful in securing out-of-state aid. He earned his doctorate in 1958. North Carolina continued its segregation scholarship program until the early 1960s, and the practice of exporting Black students fostered material and curricular denial at its Black institutions. Every dollar spent to export Black students was a dollar that the state could have used to improve the physical plant and expand the academic offerings of public Black colleges. NCC never got the pharmacy school that the state legislature authorized in 1939. During the 1949-1950 academic year, North Carolina sent 15 Black pharmacy students out of state. These numbers are small, but demonstrate demand, and it's highly likely that a pharmacy program would have drawn significant numbers of students from other states. A year before he died, President Shepherd wrote to North Carolina Governor R. Greg Cherry, inquiring about the possibility of setting up a medical department at NCC. He understood that Black Southerners' limited opportunities to pursue medicine in the region had a detrimental effect on Black healthcare, as the ratio of Black physicians to the Black population in the South was 1 Black doctor for every 6,200 Black Southerners. During the 1953-1954 academic year, North Carolina paid for 17 Black medical students to study at Meharry and Howard. There is no question that establishing pharmacy and medical schools at a Black college in North Carolina would have dramatically improved Black access to professional healthcare in the Tar Heel State and throughout the South. Stories abound of Black college presidents strategically working to establish graduate programs at their schools while also serving as champions of segregation scholarships. They, like the thousands of Black students who migrated north or west for advanced study, faced difficult decisions that intertwined race, education, civil rights, and exclusion. Through this project, I hope to expand what we know about opposition to Black education and fully acknowledge the labyrinth of schemes used to prevent Black men and women from obtaining master's, doctorate, and professional degrees. I also hope that this work causes Southern state governments and flagship institutions to consider how they can begin repairing the harm that they cause to large numbers of Black Southerners who paid taxes to outfit and upkeep graduate programs that were closed to them. There are untold numbers of African Americans who did not reach their highest potential because they had no desire to leave the region of their birth. Additionally, Southern state governments also owe a debt to state-supported Black colleges for the decades of underfunding and curricular underdevelopment. We know that segregation scholarships were big business in the South. Between 1927 and 1943, Southern states spent more than $1.2 million, roughly $18 million today, sending Black students out of state, and these programs continued for another 20 years after that. This migration of Black intellectual talent is hidden in the shadows of scholarship on the Great Migration that involved 6 million African Americans between 1915 and 1970. The practice of compelling Black students to leave home to secure the same opportunities provided to white students locally should be understood as a form of racism, just as pernicious and evil as racial violence. Like lynching and disfranchisement, segregation scholarships maintained white supremacy and suggested that there was something so peculiar, insulting, and wrong with Black people that required them to be educated elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. Thank you so much for that thought-provoking and insightful discussion. We're going to have some time for some question and answers, but first, I want to turn to Dr. Rita Thorpe Lamb. Normally, we have a member of the Thorpe family to offer some comments. So Dr. Rita Thorpe Lamb, the daughter of Dr. and Mrs. Thorpe, will offer some comments at this time.
Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank you on behalf of my sister, Gloria Earl Thorpe Doyle, and the whole Thorpe family. Thank you so much for honoring my mother, Dr. Gerstenhorn, and my father. The 31st annual Earlie Thorpe Memorial Lecture has been one of our greatest experiences every year for 31 years. My mother would be so excited with us, And we attended at Stagville Plantation and on the campus of our beloved North Carolina Central University. Yes, I'm an Eagle. Fortunately, I didn't need the segregation scholarship. You know, in my imagination, my parents drove off into the sunset to go to Ohio State University. But the truth is, they didn't own a car. So like most of those who took advantage of the segregation scholarship, they took me at 7 months old, an infant, and rode a train to the north. So I just want to say, and I thought about that, traveling while Black, when they could have taken advantage of schools in this very region. So just want to thank you for continuing this lecture. I learned so much, and everyone attending, I always take notes, and it impacts me for years, the things that I learned. So I'll be studying some more this segregation scholarship, and just want to extend our greatest gratitude to all of you connected. Dr. Harper, Dr. Wilson, thank you, Brittney. Dr. Sanders, I'm going to say Dr. Sanders, thank you so much for your research. And of course, I did attend this study, the Association for the Study of American Life and History with my father. That was always enlightening. So just thank you again for continuing this, this lecture on behalf of our family.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lamb. We appreciate that. So now we have some time for questions and answers. Questions for Dr. Sanders. So you can put questions in the chat on the YouTube channel. And I see, I'm looking here now and see if I can find some questions. So Jacoby Youngblood, who's one of our grad students, he asked, have any of the primary sources that Dr. Sanders showed, have any of those sources been used as evidence to pursue historic and/or contemporary HBCU funding in courts or legislatures?
I shouldn't say this publicly, but I'm waiting to see what happens in North Carolina in the coming years. As you know, if you might have seen, Jacoby, both Maryland and Tennessee have been quite successful in showing how decades of underfunding to the public HBCUs in those states have resulted in problems that they're still dealing with now. And so HBCUs in both Tennessee and Maryland have successfully gone into court and been able to seek redress from their state governments for this underfunding. So I'm hoping that perhaps something similar may happen in North Carolina in the coming years. You know, this idea of not wanting to put too many graduate programs at Black colleges has, you know, it is the same story across the South. And when we look at North Carolina in particular, when North Carolina was moving to desegregate higher education in the 1970s, it was the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare who said to North Carolina officials, the way to do this is to put new graduate programs at your Black colleges and to close some programs at your white colleges as a way to prevent redundancy or duplication of services. So in the mid 1970s, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare suggested that North Carolina close the nursing school at the University of Greensboro. That was to beef up nursing programs at A&T and Winston-Salem State. That didn't happen. In the 1970s, it was federal officials who were encouraging North Carolina to put a vet school at North Carolina A&T. We see that vet school went to North Carolina State University. We know that at the very time that there's a discussion about maybe putting programs at HBCUs, they opened the medical school at East Carolina University. So we see that there is a long pattern of continuing to underdevelop public Black colleges, not just in North Carolina, but across the South. So all of the evidence is there. We've seen, now Tennessee and Maryland both in the last couple of years seek very large settlements to begin addressing, state neglect. If you go back to 2001, there was the Ayers case in Mississippi where the 3 public HBCUs went into court again, looking at Mississippi's long neglect of its Black colleges. So there's precedent and there's evidence. And so we'll see what happens moving forward.
Thank you. So let's see if there's any other questions. Any questions from some of those who spoke earlier, Dr. Lamb, Dr. Wilson, Dr. Harper? If you have any questions, you can feel free to, or Ms. Reeves, to just unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. This is Carlton Wilson. Yes, Dr. Senate, I was wondering, as you work through this project and looking at the segregation scholarships, are you coming across a significant number of individuals who may have funded their own way in terms of going to these schools in the North? They didn't receive the scholarships, but they, as Black folk tend to do, they found a way in terms of doing that. Can you speculate whether there was a significant number of students who went to the North and funded their own way?
Well, I would say first that all of the segregation scholarships funded their own way. All of the segregation scholarship recipients funded their own way because the financial assistance they received from the state was inadequate. So even those who did receive some funding still had to go in their pocket and make up the shortfall. Now, many states would run out of funding. So whenever they ran out of the amount that was allocated for that year, they said, "I'm so sorry, we don't have anything else to give you." And in those cases, Black students, yes, had to find their own way. So Fred Gray, the attorney from Alabama, talks about this. He talks about, needing to find $50 here, $15 there to make up shortfalls that are caused when Alabama doesn't have any more funding. Dr. Harper will like this because Fred Gray tells a story of one time he thought he was going to have to leave law school. And when he was on his way to the registrar's office, he gets a check in the mail from Omega Psi Phi fraternity that ended up covering the differential that he had not been able to meet. Alabama is unique in that with its segregation scholarship program, it required students to pay the full amount up front and then submit a receipt for reimbursement. So that already was an obstacle that prevented many from being able to pursue graduate study, because if you're going to Michigan, Harvard, Chicago, Case Western, you might not have that tuition money up front, and then you're going to get part of it back later. So that right there led many to have to give up on their dreams. But for those that did persevere and say, "I want this," there was a lot of passing the plate, of having Black communities to support these students, of having Black sororities and fraternities to support these students. So yes, we see them having to really pool their resources and be creative about finding, financial pockets of money here and there to pay for their education. Because in no state were recipients getting the full amount paid for. And often the cost of living was so much more expensive in the North than in the South that, these students are coming out of pocket regularly just to make ends meet.
And I guess that there was an understanding that these individuals would return back to the same institution. Was there any stipulations written down that you would return back to the institution to work, to teach?
You would think, that these states would have wanted to make sure that they came back, but actually there were no stipulations. And when I think about that, I say, they probably said, these are some uppity Black people. We hope they stay up north rather than come back with all their degrees from these other institutions. When I started this project, I thought it would be a brain drain narrative. I thought all these people would go north and never come south, but the overwhelming majority do come home because this is where their families are. They felt a need. They wanted to work with Black students. They wanted to serve Black communities. And so they came back. And so this isn't the brain drain that I thought it was going to be.
Thank you. When you were talking about that, I was thinking that for those African Americans who wanted to teach at the college level, there were virtually no opportunities in the North
Mhm.
at that time. So I remember when St. Clair Drake was looking for a teaching position, and he was an African American who had a white wife, so that put him in I guess a greater quandary. He couldn't teach in the South
Mhm.
because of that situation, and he was able to teach at Roosevelt University, which was started around the time he was looking for a position, which was one of the few enlightened, predominantly white institutions in the North. But yeah, so I guess maybe in some ways, closing off, a lot of people don't think about the lack of opportunities in the North as well as in the South, but HBCUs were opportunities for Black professors. I'm wondering if you've been able to track, or you've tried to track, any of the students, particularly who went into the medical field, to know, what kind of difference it made, because there was such a dearth of Black doctors in the South. And after the closing of many of the Black medical schools right after, I guess, World War I, like Leonard Medical College or Leonard Medical School at Shaw University, it was so difficult for African Americans to enter the health profession. So did a lot of these, students who went to Meharry or other places, did they come back to their homes and become doctors?
They do indeed come back. And let me say that the closing of those Black medical schools puts a tremendous burden on Meharry and Howard, right? Because all of these other northern white schools may accept 1, 2, or 3 Black students a year, but that was it, right? They weren't going to have a significant number at one time. So you had Howard and Meharry turning away hundreds of applicants every year because there simply was no room. But for those students who are able to go to these institutions, the overall majority of them do come back. So many of the Southerners, so Howard and Meharry had Black students from all over the world, but many of the Southerners who traveled to Meharry and Howard come back to Southern states and set up medical practices. So one of the men that I write about in the book is Dr. Hubert Eaton. He actually went to the University of Michigan's medical school, and Hubert Eaton becomes a famous doctor and civil rights activist in Wilmington. But he tells an interesting story because he took the train. He says he took the train 25 times during his 4 years. And at the time, Hubert Eaton's parents were living in Winston-Salem. So he was taking, not the train, excuse me, the bus. He took maybe 25 round trip bus trips from Winston-Salem to Ann Arbor. And he always talked about, before the bus coming into Virginia, him having to get up and go to the back seat of the bus, right? So he talked, this whole traveling while Black, and buses stopping at terminals where there were no restroom facilities for Black passengers, and so there were all of these indignities that he endured as he's trying to secure his medical training. He received funding from the state of North Carolina. Once he comes back home, he sets up this practice, and because he has his own practice and he is serving a Black clientele, he's got the financial freedom to begin pursuing lawsuits challenging all forms of racial discrimination that he finds in his community. And so he really is an example of someone who not just comes back, but comes back and says, because I've got it relatively better than a lot of the people that I'm working with or that I serve, I'm going to use my voice and I'm going to use my resources, my financial resources, to try to improve things for African Americans and in the coastal part of the state. And he does just that. But yes, there's a tremendous burden that is put on these Black medical schools. And something I should say that's interesting. So, there are these handful of Black graduate programs like Atlanta, like Howard, like Meharry. They are also receiving these segregation scholarship funds, right? So it wasn't limited to students only going to white schools. And at one point, Meharry is struggling so financially, it has such a financial struggle going on, that its trustees began talking to Southern governors about Meharry actually becoming the Southern University. So kind of making it a public university for Southern students. And the 16 states would take over funding Meharry. So it was going to be this arrangement where if a court case if the NAACP brought a court case challenging segregation in medical education, the Southern governor said, if we take over Meharry, we'll be able to say we actually do have a medical school for Black students. And all of these states are going to collectively fund it. So we have provided education for Black medical students. What was interesting was that when Meharry's white administrators are proposing this to Southern state governors, it is Meharry's alumni that say, no way, no how is this going to happen. We're not going to be a party to trying to uphold segregation. We don't need money that badly, and we will challenge this tooth and nail. And so the proposal falls apart. But there was a big push for Southern states, 16 Southern state governors were going to collectively take over Meharry's administration. They were going to cover overhead. They were going to be responsible for salaries. And with that, each state would be guaranteed a certain number of spots every year for students from that state to go to medical school. So UNC could say, we provide a medical school for Black students at the University of, for white students at the University of North Carolina, and we provide a medical school for Black students at Meharry. That was to be the arrangement. But it never, it doesn't come to fruition, in part because of the large outcry from Meharry alumni.
Thank you. Yeah, white officials were always trying to do segregation on the cheap as much as possible. I saw stuff like that in private high schools in North Carolina, where Laurinburg Institute, they would, which was a private school for Blacks, and they would have some of the public school students would go there, and the state would give a very limited amount to Laurinburg instead of actually creating a Black high school in Scotland County. I see Phil Rubio, who I'm sure you know, who's professor at North Carolina A&T. He has a question. He says, I'm wondering how the NAACP fit opposition to segregation scholarships into their late 40s, early 50s direct attack on Jim Crow graduate education. He says he's thinking in particular about local NAACPs like in Houston that backed Heman Sweat's drive to integrate the University of Texas Law School.
So NAACP chapters at the local, state, and federal level or national level oppose segregation scholarships. Now, Charles Hamilton Houston said it could be an option. He said, that could be an option, but that can't be the only entryway for African Americans to secure graduate education. So this was a big debate because where you had Black college presidents like Shepard at NCC or like Rufus Atwood at Kentucky State that appeared to be in some way working with state officials to administer these segregation scholarships, NAACP officials were very upset because they really wanted a form of unity that said that this was not going to be acceptable to anyone. But most of these Black college presidents were saying, and we don't see what you're pursuing happening anytime soon. And in the interim, what is to happen to all of these students who desire advanced training? The one Black college president who stood shoulder to shoulder with the NAACP as saying that segregation scholarships were unacceptable was John W. Davis, the president of West Virginia State College. And he was adamantly opposed to West Virginia using funds to send Black students elsewhere. State officials tried to appease him by offering him $4 million during the Great Depression to upgrade West Virginia State College. He actually turns the money down. It's very amazing that in the middle of the Great Depression, a Black college administrator would turn down that amount of money, but he turns it down and says, rather than try to duplicate what's going on at West Virginia University, I believe we need to be admitting West Virginia State College students into West Virginia University. And so he ends up having all these meetings with the governor and with the president of West Virginia University. And that is how West Virginia becomes the first state to desegregate its graduate programs. So Gaines is in 38, and in 1940, West Virginia University begins admitting African Americans for graduate study. I'm sure all of you have seen the movie Hidden Figures. Katherine Johnson was one of the first 3 Black students admitted to West Virginia University as they sought compliance with the Gaines decision. And really, this really happened because of John W. Davis. He is the one saying, I don't want any money to send kids anywhere. We don't have the resources to be administering a segregation scholarship program. What we want is for West Virginia to follow the law. And so West Virginia becomes this one outlier in terms of how its Black college presidents respond. and in terms of its early admittance of Black students into the white flagship. But yes, NAACP officials were just as they were not satisfied with graduate programs being open that were not truly equal to the programs at white schools. These NAACP officials said that these segregation scholarships were inadequate because they were requiring Black students to jump through hoops that white students were not jumping through. So that was not in compliance with the Constitution.
Yeah, that's an interesting story about John Davis.
Mhm.
I mean, it kind of shows perhaps the possibilities that other Black college presidents could have pushed back more than they did. Although I wonder if there were specific things about West Virginia. I mean, did they have a majority white board of trustees at
Yes,
Davis's
they
college?
did. And West Virginia has, a very small Black population. So there was also this idea that he said it would be, Davis said it doesn't make sense financially, given our size, given the Black population, to try to replicate everything that West Virginia University has, when what I would rather have is more support for our undergraduate program, and that to allow our students who we are training to then be able to go into West Virginia University for their graduate careers. Now, for these Black college presidents who did not take the same position as Davis, they wanted to build up their schools, right? Shepherd is a strategist. He understands that perhaps he can get a law school, he may get a pharmacy school, he may get a school of library science. So he is trying to build up its institution. So in that same way, and the same thing for Atwood at Kentucky State, these are administrators who are really saying, you know what, given the political situation that's in front of me, I'm going to try to create the best opportunities for my school and for Black students. And so Shepherd in particular believed that he was going to continue to get more and more graduate programs, and that would make the segregation scholarships unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, I think about Alfonso Elder, who succeeded Shepherd. And Elder, when they tried, the UNC wanted to create a PhD program at NCCU to stop Black students from going, to the graduate programs at UNC after UNC Law School and some of the other grad programs had been desegregated. Elder pushed back against the PhD program, but he couldn't stop it, at least according to my reading, because the Board of Trustees at NCC was all white except for one or two Black members. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about Davis compared to someone like Elder, who did push back, but once he saw the handwriting on the wall, Elder accepted the money to create the PhD program and to strengthen the grad programs as well. Mm-hmm. Well, let's see. We have a question from Tony Frazier, who's actually at the National Humanities Center this year. He's a professor at NCCU. He says, how does Pauli Murray tie into your current project?
So Pauli Murray's application to UNC comes the year before UNC starts its segregation scholarship program. So she's offered funds after the program is created, but she turns them down because she understands that segregation scholarships are unconstitutional, right? She understands that she shouldn't have to, again, leave the state to get the very thing that white North Carolinians are able to get at UNC. So I do talk about her in my chapter on North Carolina, but really it is looking at those early efforts to desegregate UNC. So I talk about her in relation to Thomas Hocutt, these early efforts to get Black students into UNC Chapel Hill, because after Thomas Hocutt, that was the first time UNC or the North Carolina began talking about segregation scholarships. They talk about it in the legislature, but they don't actually take action and start a segregation scholarship program. Again, after Murray's application, coupled with the Gaines decision, that leads North Carolina to take action and say, we've got to figure out a way that we're offering graduate study to Black students.
Okay, thank you. Well, you've gotten a lot of praise, I'll say that. Great project and talk from Tony Frazier. Phil Rubio, similar in his praise. And I would echo that. I think I don't see any more questions. If we have any questions from any of the other panelists, we could take them.
I could have a quick question. So I know that with any historic event regarding migration, you start to see hubs of different groups kind of stick together. So were there any institutions that you came across where there were multiple Black graduate students that went to this institution that received segregation scholarships?
Excellent question. And yes, so you begin to see a lot of educators from North Carolina and Virginia go to Columbia and NYU pursuing masters and PhDs in education. And partly that was because a lot of them, if we think about the Great Migration and these train routes, a lot of these individuals already have family members living in New York. So it was very easy to take the train from North Carolina up to New York because you had relatives there that you could stay with. You had people who could give you the lay of the land. You might have had a teacher or a church member who went years earlier and they were also giving you advice. So you do tend to see segregation scholarship recipients choosing where to go to grad school based on who they know there. So even with Fred Gray from Alabama, at the time, he has a brother who's living not far from the Case Western campus. So that played into his decision to go there for law school. You have people who, I look at Alabama, a lot of these Alabama recipients go to school in Chicago or Michigan. And again, if we think about the train routes, that route from the deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, goes up into Chicago and Detroit. And so that's how, they're following train routes that they're familiar with because they have family members, church members, friends who've already made those same, they've already made those same journeys. So yes, it did play an impact. And a lot of times what you hear or what I've read, like from people I've interviewed who are still living or from oral histories that I've read, once they got to these new cities, their whole social circle was based off of people who were from the same place that they were, so that's who they socialized with, that's who they studied with, that's who they traveled with, because oftentimes they weren't going to make friends with people in their graduate cohorts. Some of these students that they were in their classes didn't acknowledge them, didn't talk to them. So, and also most of them couldn't live on campus. So they're renting rooms from local Black families, and these families may take in 2 boarders, right? And so you're boarding with someone else who's from North Carolina, and you and that person become really, really close because, you're both in a new, strange city and you don't have any family support there, or you don't have any, church support until you begin to build those relationships.
Yeah, I had a quick comment. Absolutely amazing presentation, Dr. Sanders. One of the things when you were talking about, especially when you showed those photographs of those women, it made me think about the number of women Black women who went to get PhDs. And it made me think about one of Durham's residents, Dr. Lavonia Allison, who went to Columbia in this same time frame to get her PhD. And she talks about the exact same way that you're describing it. Like, we had to go. There was no other option for us. But I also wondered if she was a recipient of one of these scholarships, segregation scholarships.
I haven't come across her name. I'm still, because most of the records that are easily accessible are like from 1958 and earlier. A lot of times these archivists have been getting it, a little squirmish when I try to access 1960s or later records because many of these individuals are still living. So I'm still trying to get access and to learn, to get information on recipients from later years. She very well could have been a recipient. I would have to look at exactly what degree she received because it would depend at that point if this degree was being offered at NCC or if UNC had began to admit Black students in that particular discipline. So, but what I will say is even after UNC began admitting African-Americans into the dental school, they continued to pay for Black students to go to get dental training elsewhere because they didn't really want too many Black students at the dental school at one time. So even after we began to see some of these programs desegregate, they would continue to pay for larger numbers of Black students to go elsewhere.
Okay, thank you so much for shedding light on this very important topic. So I want to thank Dr. Crystal Sanders for this excellent and thought-provoking and informative talk she gave today. We're definitely looking forward to the book. I know it probably won't be tomorrow, but love to see the book and some of these great stories about some of the people that many of us know about, but want to know more about. People like Dr. Hubert Eaton. I definitely like to know more about his story. Thanks also to everybody who logged in today to listen to today's 31st annual Earlie Thorpe Memorial Lecture. And good afternoon to everybody. Hope to see you next year, perhaps in person.
Thank you.
Bye.